There we are. Okay. And then, so welcome everyone to our Friday afternoon at the Manor. And then I will bring it over to Susan Johnson, our wonderful host. And over to you, Susan, who will introduce our wonderful keynote for today.
Thank you everyone for coming. We're very honored to have the Reverend Brent Hawkes with us today. He has been the basis behind Gay Pride in Toronto and, raising the profile and making things happen. So, Reverend, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the invitation today to be with you. And so what I'm going to do is just share what I'm up to now and talk a little bit about my history in the process of that. And then hopefully we'll have a lively Q&A a little bit later. I've been an LGBT activist for a little over 43 years. I arrived in Toronto in 1976 and became the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto in 1977. And in that role here, I was both a pastor of a church and also an activist in a variety of different social justice issues. And the MCC Toronto is predominantly an LGBTI congregation. And as I said, I was there for over 40 years. And more recently, I'm the founder and the executive director of Rainbow Faith and Freedom, which is an organization founded to confront religious-based discrimination, specifically religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia here in Canada and around the world. And during my time at MCC Toronto, in addition to ministry and in the local church, I had a broader profile. And part of my role, especially early on, was reconnecting people who had given up on church or been driven out of church and try to bring them back into faith community again. And so over the many years involved in that, but also was deeply involved in many social justice issues. I remember back in 1978, I think it was, when Anita Bryant came to Toronto campaigning to pull back any laws that we'd gotten changed. She was doing a crusade throughout North America, and she would go into different cities and organized for those cities to roll back the progressive gains that she made. And when she came to Toronto, she was going to be singing and campaigning for that at People's Church. And so a large group of people decided to have a protest. And while I support that, absolutely, I was concerned about the image of all of these kind of very pious Christians inside People's Church singing and praising God and angry activists outside of the church. So in addition to the protest, I organized an interfaith service in support of LGBTI human rights, or in the old days, what we would call gay rights. And so we had this interfaith service, and we had the moderator of the United Church, the first woman ordained an Anglican priest in Canada, a Jewish rabbi, and we're there. And the Reverend Bob Wolf, who started MCC Toronto, was the guest preacher. And it was covered on all of the TV stations. And this is the first time that an LGBT-led religious worship service was covered on TV. And the reason why I thought that was important, because whenever the religious right are able to frame an argument, God versus gays, holy people praying, angry demonstrators, then we always lose. And I've always felt that the role of our church and the role of LGBT people of faith was to undercut that argument by saying, hey, we're here too. Not all, people of faith are opposed. And so that was my kind of first big step into the social justice area in a public way. And then the next thing that came was the Ontario legislature was going to introduce, I should say, not the Ontario legislature, the Liberal Party, who are a minority, were going to introduce an amendment to the Human Rights Code. And we knew it was going to be defeated because of the overwhelming conservative government of the time. And up until then, LGBT people had no protection in the Human Rights Code. So we were fired from jobs regularly. We were denied housing or kicked out of housing regularly. We were denied public services like membership in organizations or service in restaurants or taxis, etc. And so there were lots of cases of people being discriminated against, and there was no recourse. And so the Liberal Party of the day were going to introduce an amendment. Sheila Copps was going to introduce it, but we knew it was going to be defeated. So 3 of us were trained in civil disobedience, and I went out and bought a pair of handcuffs and snuck them into the legislature. And when they defeated the bill, I stood up and started reading out the names of organizations that supported us. And so I would handcuff myself to the ready first and start reading it out. And then the second person and then the third person stood up. And so they had to adjourn the legislature till they found wire cutting tools to cut the handcuffs off and to kick us out. Well, they didn't pass, obviously, the legislation that time, but the next time they did, but I'll get to that in a moment or two. That same year was the year of the infamous bath raids in Toronto. And that's when the Toronto police arrested over 300 gay men in a variety of different baths throughout the city. And but they didn't just arrest them, they also terrorized them. They tore the bathhouses apart, a huge amount of damage that was done during the raid. And at one of the baths, the Richmond Street baths, they lined up a bunch of gay men in the shower area. And one of the police officers said, "I wish these showers were hooked up to gas instead of water." And one of the gay men there, his parents had survived the Holocaust. And so to their credit, the media really covered this action of the police and really portrayed it as a huge overreaction. And the police could have gone into one bath and arrested one owner and one patron, taken it to court and tried to close the baths down, but they didn't. And so everybody seemed to know somebody who was arrested. And in those days, when people were arrested in an activity like being in the baths or in other activities, then often their names were published. And because there was no human rights protection, people were fired from their jobs. But even worse, because people hadn't come out to their families or to their friends, then it meant that people were thinking about or committing suicide because their names were published. And so the gay community responded. They got very, very angry about what was happening. There were a lot of protests, and the police were getting more and more violent. The gay community were responding with some violence, overturning police cars, setting garbage cans on fire, etc. And at one of the demonstrations, the police were clearing the streets, and a gay man fell, an elderly man fell, and the police were kicking him. And so I jumped in and pulled him out, and then 2 police officers held me while a third one beat me up. So it was a really dangerous time and a difficult time. The police were certainly not the friends of the LGBT community. In fact, at demonstrations, we used to say, leave in groups because you may get beaten up by the gay bashers or you may get beaten up by the police. And so because things were getting more and more violent, I decided to go on a hunger strike to protest police activities and to demand an investigation. And so I was on my hunger strike, water only, for 25 days. And eventually the city of Toronto passed a motion to hire an investigator. And they hired a human rights reporter for the Globe and Mail named Arnold Bruner to study the issue. And Arnold interviewed me, a lot of LGBT leaders, interviewed the police, interviewed politicians, and he came out with the Bruner report. And it was a brilliant report, and it gave us almost everything we asked for. And it called for major change in the relationship between police and the LGBT community. Things like that the police should hire openly gay members, set up a liaison committee, and have training for new police and existing police officers. And symbolically also that the police should recognize that the gay community is a legitimate part of the city of Toronto. And so I was really pleased that the hunger strike brought about that report, but it then took us like 25 years to get the recommendations implemented. I always say to people, if you're going to be involved in police reform, you've got to be involved in it for the long haul, because sometimes you'll get little gains and you'll fall back, and you can't get discouraged, you can't give up. I've often said one of the most powerful things in the world is an optimistic activist. because we just keep at it and at it and at it. So then the next thing that happened was in 1986, when the NDP this time were a minority, and they introduced an amendment to the Human Rights Code to give us protection. And at that time, the Liberal government were in power as a minority government, and they had not announced yet whether they were going to support the legislation. And without their support, we knew it wasn't going to get passed. So we coordinated a petition of religious leaders across Ontario who supported the amendment. And we had over 125 people sign the petition. And we circulated it to all of the members of the provincial parliament, of the legislature, on a Monday. And by Thursday of that week, David Peterson announced that the Liberal Party were going to support the amendment. So we knew, therefore, it was going to pass. And a few months later, I saw David Peterson at an event, and he said that it was our church's petition that enabled his party to go ahead and support the amendment. Because he said, up until then, the Liberals were being hammered, particularly in rural Ontario, by evangelical Christians and by Catholic bishops. And so they needed more religious support, and that's what brought about the petition that we got together. So after that, the next issue was relationship recognition, because up until then, our relationships were not recognized in terms of pension, in terms of joint custody of children, and in terms of things as basic as hospital visitations. So John and I, my partner, we've been together 40 years. And if in those days would have gotten sick and been in intensive care, the other person would not have been allowed to even visit them because we were not defined as family. So we couldn't get into intensive care. And so a bill to recognize our relationships was introduced. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough support and it was defeated. And folks were very, very angry, as you can imagine, because of the emotional attachment to having our relationships recognized. And then the next issue after that was equal marriage, but I'll come back to that in a few moments. So, in fact, I'll come back to it right now. So, in the fall of the year 2000, 8 couples had gone to City Hall to ask for a marriage license. 8 gay lesbian couples for a marriage license. And the city said, unfortunately, we can't give you your license. We want to, we would like to, but we can't. Because in Canada, marriage is governed by mainly the province and the federal government. The federal government decides who can marry, and the province decides who can officiate. So there's kind of a dual role between the two. And so they said, we can't give you a license because neither the provincial government nor the federal government have supported it. And so those 8 couples took the city, the province, and the federal government to court. And while the court cases were starting out, our lawyer, Douglas Elliott, the lawyer for the church, Metropolitan Community Church, he was intervening with the other lawyers on behalf of their case. And in one of their meetings, Professor Kathleen Leahy, professor at Queen's University, she had done some research into marriage law in Ontario, and she found that in Ontario, there's 2 ways to get married. There's the typical way today that most people get married. They go to City Hall, they get a marriage license, and then they go to a rabbi, a priest, an imam, and ask for them to officiate at the ceremony. And so it's the combination of getting the marriage license from City Hall, along with having an official ceremony where the documents are signed and witnessed and the couple are married. But there's also a second way to get married in Ontario, and in a couple of 3 other provinces in Canada, although it's generally being done away with. And that's called the reading of the banns, B-A-N-N-S. And that's where a couple would go to, in the Christian sense, their pastor, and they would say to their pastor, that they wanted to get married. And if the pastor decided, and clergy have always had the freedom to say yes or no, and if the pastor decided yes, that he would marry them, then the pastor would read the banns 3 Sundays in the congregation. The assumption was, it's an old-fashioned assumption, but the assumption was that everybody in the congregation would know these people. And so if they didn't meet the criteria, somebody could speak up. And in that section on the banns, it said, official objections were things like The people are brother and sister, and so they shouldn't get married. One of them's already been married. One of them's underage. One of them's not mentally competent to make the decision, those kinds of things. But in that section of the act, it said any two persons. It never said in that section male and female. And so Professor Leahy said to Douglas Elliott, Douglas, I think Brent can already marry gay couples, because I had a license at that time to do weddings, but it was weddings for straight couples. And so Douglas approached me and said, would you consider it? I said, yeah, but let me talk to my board. I talked to the board and they enthusiastically said yes. I think we all had no idea what we were really getting into in terms of the magnitude of what was about to happen. So on December the 10th, 2000, we announced at our church that beginning in January of 2001, January of 2001, that we would begin marrying LGBT couples. And so on December the 10th, we read the banns for the very first time in church. And we chose a lesbian couple and a gay male couple. We wanted two couples, so there was both male and female represented. And so we read the banns. There were no objections. And I said, hearing no objections, we will proceed with the second one, Sunday of reading the banns. And everyone stood up and they cheered and they hugged and there were lots of tears. It was a very exciting moment. Now, CBC was there. We leaked to CBC that we were doing this. And so they covered it. And so the second Sunday, the next week, I had gotten 2 phone calls that week from 2 individuals saying, Brent, we're going to come and object. And one of them was the Reverend Ken Campbell, notorious anti-gay crusader. And I debated him, argued with him many times. And he called and said he was going to come to object. And I said, Ken, here's how it's going to happen. And I will recognize you when you raise your hand, but please be respectful. It's in our worship service. It's during a service and stuff. And he said, no problem. And so I said, the 2 couples' names want to get married. Does anyone know of any lawful reason why they may not? And Ken put his hand up and I recognized him. And he said, I object because the Bible says it should be a man and woman. And so I said, and then the second person objected for the same reason. And then I said, well, hearing your objections, I rule that your objections are not legal. And we will proceed with reading the bans. It felt very powerful as an agent of the state to be able to make that declaration. And again, everyone cheered and celebrated. And the third week, 2 more people came and objected. And they objected for exactly the same reason that the Bible says. And I that day did the same thing. We heard their objections and I ruled that their objections are not legal because it wasn't one of the criteria in that section of the act, and that we would proceed with the weddings. And again, cheering and celebrating and tears, and it was amazing. So during that time frame from when we first started it on January the 10th until, December the 10th, until January the 14th, 2001, during that period, one of the media came to me and said that they had done a public opinion poll just before our announcement, coincidentally, in terms of what percentage of the Canadian population supported equal marriage, gay marriage. And then after the weddings, they did another one. And the reporter said it was the biggest shift in public opinion on any social issue in the history of Canada. And that was because everybody was talking about it. Talking about this church that was going to start marrying gay couples. And so people were coming out to families and friends. People were standing up and saying why they thought it was right and why it should happen. But the death threats started coming. And the police came to me and said, Brent, you've had death threats. You've got to have protection. You've got to wear your bulletproof vest. I had a bulletproof vest from previous years when my life had been threatened, and to wear in pride parades and stuff like that. And so they said, you've got to have protection. So on the night before the weddings, I called my family in New Brunswick and I said, I love you. And if anything happens, please know that I love you. And that morning, John and I got picked up by some bodyguards and to take us to church. It was on a Sunday. So we had church services that morning at 9 and 11, and the weddings were in the afternoon. And I had 12 bodyguards protecting me. I half jokingly say that of the 12 bodyguards, they were 11 of the toughest looking lesbians you ever seen in your life, and 1 gay man coordinating it all. So I felt very secure. So they picked John and I up and took us to church by an alternate route in case someone was waiting along the way to try to get at me. Took us to church, rushed us into the church. and so that we could have the 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock service before the wedding in the afternoon. And at the 11 o'clock service, we kind of let our guard down because we didn't expect problems until the afternoon. And so a woman came up in the middle of the service and started throwing pamphlets, anti-gay pamphlets around the church. And she came up and assaulted me. And so the police arrested her and she was charged with assault and found guilty with assault eventually. But that kind of, again, raised our concern about the afternoon. So in the afternoon came and there were 50 police officers in the church. There were 1,000 people who were lined up outside to observe the weddings. It was very exciting and very terrifying at the same time. There were 80 media outlets from around the world, some of whom had never, ever covered anything positive about LGBT until those weddings. And so the weddings proceeded and without incident. There were protesters outside. And at the end of the ceremony, I declared the male couple and the female couple duly married, and according to the publication of the bans. And people stood and applauded and cried and applauded and cried and cheered, and they were just so excited to witness this moment. And afterwards, the picture of me in the middle with the male couple and the female couple was on the front pages of all of the newspapers. As I said, some positive coverage in places around the world that had never had positive coverage before. But again, because of the continuing death threats, I couldn't leave my house for 2 weeks without a bodyguard, and couldn't get a newspaper or get milk or go for a walk and stuff. It continued to be pretty scary. The government of the day, the Mike Harris government, announced that they would not recognize the weddings. They wouldn't register them. And so we sued them. We took the city, the province, and the feds to court. And we asked the judge to join our court case with the 8 couples who had already sued for recognition. And the judge did that. And then we eventually won the court case that it was discriminatory not to allow gay couples and they should be allowed to marry. But the judge delayed her decision for 2 years, put her decision on hold, for 2 years to give the government's time to make the legislative changes and all that kind of stuff. So then the government appealed our win, and it went to the appeals court, and we won at the appeals court, but the appeals court ruled that the marriages had to be effective immediately, no more waiting. And they also backdated their approval to include our weddings. So that's what made January the 14th, 2001, our weddings, the first legal same-sex weddings, certainly in Canada, and we think in the modern history of the world. We planned our day because we knew that the Netherlands had already decided to give equal marriage, and they were going to do it on February the 1st, so we planned ours 2 weeks before them. Not that we're competitive, but anyway, we were, and we won. So we won the appeals case. It was ordered to be effective immediately, backdated to approve ours. But then the Harper government decided to have a free vote in Parliament on it. And we won that free vote. And so that's what made equal marriage legal in Canada. And we've seen it now spreading around the world. So that's, and as a result of that, in 2007, I was appointed to the Order of Canada. It was a really, I didn't even know I was nominated. You're not supposed to be told when you're nominated, so I didn't know. And I got a call one day, and my assistant at the time said, Brent, there's a call for you from the Governor General's office. And I thought it was because of someone else at the church who had been nominated, and they were calling me for a reference. And so when I picked up, when I got on the phone, the woman from the Governor General's office said, Reverend Hawkes, I hope you'll experience this to be a very pleasant phone call. And I thought, maybe it's not about someone else. And she said, the nominating committee for the Order of Canada, headed by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has nominated you for the Order of Canada. Would you accept? And I said, does anybody ever not? And she said, yes. Some people from Quebec have not, and other people who are too shy have not. And I said, yes, and accept. And she said, you can't tell anyone except for your partner until it's announced in a few days. And so I ultimately was flown to Ottawa, John and I, and was given the Order of Canada by Governor General McCargeon. And when she pinned it on me, she said, Brent, this is for all of those years working for inclusion. And it was really an amazing, amazing moment. In 2011, I officiated at the state funeral for the Honorable Jack Layton, who was the head of Canada's official opposition at the time, a good friend, and a really, really good friend of the LGBT community, and a huge supporter. That service was watched by 4 million people. And as the announcers were talking about it, they said who I was and my gay activism, et cetera. And there were some amazing, beautiful stories of people watching that program. One of them, a mom knew when she heard that I was going to be officiating. She had her 14-year-old son. She said, "I want you to watch the service." And she thought he was gay, but he'd never felt comfortable coming out to her. And so they were sitting there watching the service. And at one point during the service, I made a reference to John, and I said, "John, my husband." And she said, "His face just lit up." Right. And so it was pretty amazing. In 2015, I was appointed to the Order of New Brunswick, my home province, for my human rights work. And I, as I said, was involved in the working on getting the Ontario Human Rights Code changed. So that's some of my background. And I want to talk now about the relationship between religion and sexuality, and between religion and human rights. And those relationships have historically been full of conflict. And activists all over the world have said that the main opposition to LGBT human rights is religious-based discrimination, particularly religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia. Now, I want to be clear, too often it's said religion is the enemy. And I think that's a huge mistake to use that terminology. It's not that religion is the enemy, it's religious-based discrimination that's the enemy. And so if we're ever going to help to change the situation where LGBT people are more included and get more rights, we have to deal with religious opposition, with religious-based discrimination. And in many countries around the world, religious leaders still have significant impact over public policy and over politicians. In fact, in some countries, politicians don't take action until they call the religious leaders and find out how they're supposed to vote on some of these issues. And with the increase in fundamentalism around the world, particularly the increase in Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism around the world, both, we're seeing in many parts of the world that advancement of LGBTI human rights can no longer be taken for granted. We always thought enough young people die and enough young people are born and enough old people die, that eventually we'll get our human rights. And for a while, it looked like that was the projection, until the rise of fundamentalism. And what we're seeing now is we're losing ground in many parts of the world. And so, we can't just take fighting religion as our main strategy. We have to work at transforming religion. And so, I've always said that a religious attack requires a religious response. So part of what Rainbow Faith and Freedom, my new organization, is about is how do we mobilize religious support? How do we help our allies and others to speak up on behalf of LGBT inclusion in society? And whenever, as I said earlier, whenever the argument is framed as God versus gays, we lose. And so we need to make sure that LGBT people of faith and our allies are also speaking up. So I want to talk about some of the strategies that we're using at Rainbow Faith and Freedom. So for the 40 years that I was at MCC Toronto, most of my human rights work was very reactive. The police would raid the baths, we'd react. There'd be some politician say something, we'd react. There'd be some arrest, we'd react. And I always wanted to be able to be more proactive. What would it look like if we had strategies for changing the situation and not just putting out fires? But I couldn't get to it because the church kept growing and growing and growing, and I became more and more a bureaucrat running an institution. And so I really couldn't get at this proactive piece. And how do you change hearts and minds? So for a long time, the LGBT community has been on the defensive, and I think it's now time for us to be more strategic and be on the offense. So, in 2015, I had a sabbatical, and I was approaching my 40th anniversary when I had decided I was going to retire and do this human rights stuff. And I was given some advice that for my sabbatical, I should focus on what I want to do when I retire. So I went to New York, Washington, and Geneva, and I met with over 10 international LGBT organizations and allied organizations, and a lot of activists in New York, Washington, and Geneva. And I was dressed like this in my holy attire. And I said to all of them, my impression is that you're proudly secular and that you see religion as the enemy. And they all said yes. And so I said, so you're doing nothing to work with LGBT Christians or LGBT Muslims or LGBT Jews? And they said nothing. And so I outlined my concept for Rainbow Faith and Freedom. And I said, but this would be about changing hearts and minds. It's not about legislative change. I've done that. You win some, you lose some, and then you lose what you won. And it's not about changing denominational policy, because that takes decades. But it's about changing hearts and minds so that the average family wouldn't kick out their kids when they come out. And the average local faith community would still welcome LGBT people and their families. I said, so if I was setting up an organization to do that, would you work with me? And they all said yes. And some of them even said, this is the missing piece. Now, there are brave individuals doing this all over the world, but it's not coordinated very well. And it's certainly not supported financially very well. And so people are left on their own, and no one is looking at best practices. If something is effective in a part of Brazil, would it work in the Ukraine, for instance? And so, and also, how do we build ally support around the world? And I think that the gay community has made a huge mistake when they brand religion, all religion, as the problem. And I think that, and part of what's the damage that's done in that is it's scared away our allies, and we haven't built the ally support that we need. That's crucial. So with their positive feedback, I began to form Rainbow Faith and Freedom. And when I retired in January 2018, on the last day of January, the first day of February, I jumped into this. I probably should have taken a few months to rest, but I didn't. So we formed a steering committee, we drafted a vision, a mission, our 3 key pillars or programs, our manifesto, the values of the organization. The name Rainbow Faith and Freedom was chosen, and we were mandated to fight religious-based LGBTI discrimination. So in 2019, I made some international trips to Geneva and other parts of the world to promote Rainbow Faith and Freedom, met with the Canadian Embassy in Geneva, very, very supportive. Went to the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C., a scary event under Trump and Pompeo. They were trying to make sure that freedom of religion trumped all other freedoms, to set back the human rights movement for decades. And so that's still the intention of the right wing in the US. It's a very dangerous trend. And through these interactions, it became very clear that people felt that Rainbow Faith and Freedom's advent was very timely and needed. A lot of enthusiasm for what we were doing, seen as a missing piece of the puzzle. And so we continued to build the organization. And so when we founded Rainbow Faith and Freedom to confront religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia, the Parliament of World Religions was meeting in Toronto in 2018. So we took advantage of that and organized a one-day symposium right after the Parliament, where a lot of people were in the city. And we had 25 activists from around the world, 6 of whom we paid for to come in for the Parliament and stay for our symposium. And so we presented the concept of Rainbow Faith and Freedom to get their feedback. And there were lots of aspects of what we were proposing they liked, but they had a lot of suggestions for improvements. And it was so helpful. It was such an exciting day to, wow, that's amazing. We hadn't thought of that. We hadn't thought of that. And so we took some time to revamp the vision for the plan for Rainbow Faith and Freedom. We had subsequent consultations with people who do international work. Homophobia and transphobia have impacted every institution in society, whether it's the legal profession, the educational profession, the medical profession, et cetera. So religion isn't immune from that. We're not alone for having a bad history around the treatment of LGBTI communities. But I think it is fair to say that religion should be held to a higher standard than all those other institutions. because supposedly the central value of all of the world's major religions is compassion. And so, religion can either be an obstacle or it can be an asset in expanding human rights. And, the most visible thing that we hear about is how religious-based discrimination has been an obstacle to full inclusion for LGBT people. And so our community needs more training and strategizing in how to confront the religious attack, how to deal with it. Also, seeing religion as the enemy has added difficulty to the lives of LGBT people of faith. We are both attacked by the religious right for being gay, and we were attacked by the gay community for being religious. I remember one in the fall of 1976. I went to a gay rights conference at Jarvis Collegiate here in Toronto, and one of the and I had my clerical shirt on with a stripe on it. In our denomination, that meant you were a student clergy. And that gay leader came up to me and he spit on me. And he said, "You're selling out to the enemy by being a person of faith." So LGBT people of faith have not always felt welcome in some aspects of the gay movement. And I understand why. And so, again, needing to change that and to empower LGBTI people of faith to be viewed as an important part of the struggle to achieve equality and to help to build up human rights. So, according to the Global Philanthropy Project, spirituality is the most underfunded of the various strategies to achieve LGBT equality. And Rainbow Faith and Freedom is uniquely positioned to address the issues that I've laid out for you today. And we can be that voice helping to counter the religious attack. We can empower LGBT people of faith to be more effective spokespersons. And we can train organizations like Pride's in terms of how to respond to the religious attack. So as we participate in the longer term strategy of building religious support and transforming religious opposition, we need to represent a new approach. And so here's the vision of Rainbow Faith and Freedom is to improve the lives of LGBTI people globally by confronting and decreasing religious-based discrimination. And our mission is to inspire faith communities and to inspire families to be safer places for LGBTI people by changing hearts and minds. And so we have 3 programs, 3 pillars. And the first is our Canadian pillar. And we recently had a report done looking at the landscape of faith-based, heterosexist, and transphobic discrimination in Canada. In Canada, we have equality in law, but that doesn't mean equality in practice. And there are lots of places in Canada where there needs to be change. And I've once paraphrased another person, Martin Luther King, who used to talk about the most segregated hour of the week is Sunday morning at 11, when Christian churches meet. And I would also say the most homophobic and transphobic hour of the week is Sunday morning at 11. And so we have a lot of work to do in Canada. Even though it's seen to be one of the safest places, we still have a lot of work to do. So this report took a look at faith communities, families, education, and healthcare, and looked at those 4 areas over the last 15 years and documented the extensive amount of discrimination that exists. And I'm not going to go through all the details of the report because I'm going on. And I'll just give you one non-religious example. Let's say you're in a gay relationship and you have an older partner and they need to go into a hospice. The last thing you should have to do is search around for a hospice that's going to be safe for your partner, or put your partner in a hospice and then worry about how they're going to be treated. And we're hearing more and more cases in long-term care facilities of LGBT people, seniors, being pressured to give up their homosexuality before they die, a kind of conversion therapy for the elderly, right? And so we as the community need to do that work. We need to identify which hospices are safe and let people know. We need to provide resources for hospices that want to do better. And we need to challenge hospices, frankly, that are homophobic and not safe. And that's just one example. I think the same thing is true for private schools or independent schools. Same thing is true for faith-based hospitals. And certainly the same thing is true for many religious institutions. The second program is our resource pillar. And that program, we got a grant last fall, and we're able to give it a real boost. We've set up a portal on our website, rainbowfaithandfreedom.org, and we have over 200 resources there for people who are coming out and they are either gay and Christian or gay and Muslim or gay and Jewish, and they want to be able to maintain their spirituality while they celebrate their sexuality. There's also resources there for families dealing with a family member, etc. So making sure that there are resources there. And then the final pillar is our international pillar. There are still 70 countries in the world where gay and lesbian people are arrested for same-sex sexual relationships, having mutual sex, mutually agree upon sex between two adults in private, are arrested and put in jail. And in 10 of those countries, gay people are executed simply for being who they are. And if you go out in a satellite and look back on planet Earth, there are no national boundaries. We are responsible for each other. And so part of our job will be to partner with countries, partner with activist groups on the ground in those countries, and develop strategies for reducing the amount of religious-based homophobia and transphobia in those countries. We will be guided by the people on the ground. They are the experts. We're not the experts. This is not about imperialism or conversion. It's about trying to mobilize North American support to help people on the ground effect change in those areas. So we've chosen Jamaica and Fiji as our first two countries. We're working with our partners there to develop grant applications, and people are really excited to have the help. And this is going to be a really concrete way where North Americans can help. So in conclusion, there are brave individuals all over the world doing this work on religion and LGBT human rights. And how can we help? How can we support this important work? Religion is not the enemy. Religious-based discrimination is. And dealing with it will not only help families and both local faith communities to be safe places for LGBTI people, but will also eventually help to support legislative change. In closing, religion got us into this mess, and religion needs to get us out of this mess. So for more information about us, you can go to rainbowfaithandfreedom.org. Thank you, John Joseph and your team for the invitation today. And I'll stop and take a breath, and we can have hopefully some interesting questions and discussions and disagreements. And away we go.
Well, thank you, Brent. That was absolutely phenomenal. And as people, do people have questions? I have a few myself, but let's see if anyone else have questions. Or no, yes, no, yes, no, yes. So, well, question I would have, Brent, related to this, when you look at LGBTQ rights around the globe, but then would you say that rights for women are parallel to this? How would you put movement or discussion? In a sense, can you have LGBTQ rights if you don't have rights for women in a country, or should we not be? I mean, I'm assuming. Well, one can say, should we then be bring that into the loop of this? Is because I think of many countries where women, the rights are below ground. And so, what are your thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, great question, John Joseph. So I think if I had if I had the influence to be able to lay out, here's the agenda for achieving human rights, here's the sequencing, right? I think that would be helpful, but it doesn't always work that kind of, you do A and then B and then C and then D. It really varies in countries, but generally, I found that it's true that when women's rights are advanced and with civil rights are advanced, then gay rights can swoop in on the coattails of those two. And the women's movement and the people of color movement say that in North America, they are shocked at how much progress the gay community has made in such a short period of time. But we've been able to make that progress because of the work that they've done. The women's movement talking about, our bodies are our own and you have no say over our bodies and there should be equality. The civil rights movement talking about non-discrimination and differences should be respected. I mean, they paved the way for the gay community to make the progress we make. And another example I'll use is the Stephen Lewis Foundation, in terms of working on HIV/AIDS in Africa, found that the misogyny and the lack of rights for women really makes their work difficult. And when women have full equality, then they said that opens the door for them to be able to deal with HIV/AIDS. And when there's so much homophobia, it's hard for them to do their work. So they've expanded their work to support women's rights and to support gay rights so that they can really get at the issue of HIV/AIDS more effectively. So, so absolutely, I would say that progress in some of those areas helps. And I'll just use one other example. A bishop from Africa, an Anglican bishop, who was very gay positive, came to North America to speak. And he said, oftentimes North American Christians think all we have to do is go to these countries and talk about homosexuality in the Bible. And if we can just get them to understand homosexuality in the Bible, then the things will be okay. But he said in some of our countries, it needs to start with basic sex education, right? And so I think there are lots of foundational pieces that could make the achievement of LGBTI human rights easier. And some people are working on those pieces. But we don't always have the luxury of saying, okay, we're going to put gay rights on the back burner while we focus on something else. You also have to go with people's passions and the timing, et cetera. But a great question.
Any questions from anyone else? Susan.
What's bothered me for the last, it's been going on more than 4 years in the US, it's the blatant hypocrisy that they either do not recognize or, address. It's like, it goes totally against all teachings, and I don't know, how do you fight that, or can you?
Yeah, I think that, it's been, there's the part of the problem is the way we approach scripture. And, if you approach scripture as a rule book, then you have a lot of problems, frankly, because there's a lot of contradictions. The Bible both confronts slavery and supports slavery. The Bible both supports women's role in faith institutions and seems to demean it. In the book of Leviticus, it says women who wear red are condemned. It says women who commit adultery should be put to death. Delinquent teenagers should be put to death. Right? It says you shouldn't eat shellfish. And so there's lots of things in scripture that today we no longer pay attention to. But people pick and choose. And so they'll say, oh, no, we have to obey this rule, but we'll ignore that rule. And so, someone once said that a grade 3 education of scripture is a dangerous thing. And so I think, we have to deal with those sections that supposedly deal with homosexuality, and many scholars today saying that they aren't about homosexuality, they're about pedophilia, or they're about violence or rape. But we also, I think, need to educate around what is the Bible. To me, the Bible is a history book, not a rule book. The Bible is the history of the ancient people of faith and how they wrestled with the same issues we wrestle. Is there a God? Is there life after death? Why are we here? And sometimes they got it right, and sometimes they got it wrong. Example, when the people of Israel left the promised land and they were wandering in the desert and they finally got to the promised land, they sent spies in. And the spies noticed that there were what they noticed and came back and reported on it. And the Bible says, and God told them to go in and massacre all the men, women, and child and take possession of the land. Now, a loving God would never tell people to do that, right? And so I think, if we look at the Bible as a history book and not a rule book, if we look at the Bible as metaphor, then we won't have a problem with discrimination against women or gays, et cetera. But I think that, within all of the world's religions, there's both a fundamentalist wing and moderate and progressive wing. And unfortunately, we're in this time in society where the fundamentalist wings of some of our major religions are winning, are taking over, and the more moderate or progressive wings are losing the voice. And so I think that part of what we have to wrestle with is fundamentalism in all of its forms.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that helps a little bit, Susan, with your question.
Thank you. So another question would be, if you take the countries of Russia and China that has systemic governments that one might say are contrary to what Rainbow Faith and Views is trying to accomplish, would you say or comment that I still personally think there's potential. It's like there's potential everywhere. And I always go back to whatever government is in power, even in China now, there's still the heritage that they have of harmony and yin and yang. And then, of course, Russian culture. I mean, they've gone through their own seismic shifts. And one can't assume democracy and capitalism is the answer for whatever government plans, but I think fairness of people. And so, thinking specifically of Russia and China, and we've heard some of the things that have happened, but do you find there's potential at present, or do we wait for that to have make inroads there?
Yeah, I think in Russia in particular, there were some really significant inroads being made. Young, particularly Christian, Orthodox Christian, gay people were setting up organizations. There was a drop-in center in St. Petersburg that was run by young LGBT Christians, Orthodox Christians. And someone came in one day with a gun and shot people and blinded one woman in that process. And the next day they opened back up again. I mean, brave individuals. The problem is, sometimes religion is the religious-based discrimination is the issue. In other cases, it's the misuse of religion by political leaders that's the problem. And the most blatant example of this was Osama bin Laden, using Islam as a way to gain power and stuff, and is not a very religious person, right? And we see this with some Canadian politicians who've used religion who don't go to church very much. And Donald Trump would be the perfect example, the president of the United States with the least amount of church attendance ever, and yet he used the religious right to gain power. And so sometimes it is religious-based discrimination itself, but other times it's the use of religion as a means to an end by some people. And so in Russia, we saw some progress happening and stuff, and then Putin, wanting to maintain power, got in bed with the religious leaders, basically, and so you have the awful situation of the Russian Orthodox Church and the violence that it perpetrates against pride parades on a regular basis, and now Putin banning, siding with the church. And Jesus had the situation, when the Romans and the political leaders of his day got together, and whenever the religious leaders, especially conservative religious leaders and political leaders, get together, people are in trouble, right? And so we see that in Russia. So I think there's hope in Russia. I think the bravery of some of those individuals, again, their work needs to be supported. It's not funded well at all, and they do it at great risk. So where I have hope is the ex-Soviet Union when it broke up. Those countries like Moldova, Estonia, etc., they all have Russian as their main language or their second language. And they have some really progressive LGBT movements in some of those ex-Soviet countries, Eastern European countries. And so my hope is that the growth of the gay rights movement in some of those neighboring companies will be able to have some impact on Russia eventually. And so with China, it's a different situation, because when I said that activists all over the world say that religious-based discrimination is the main obstacle, that's true, except for some parts of Asia. And in some parts of Asia, it's not so much about religion as it is family wanting to have kids and wanting to make sure that the family is extended, et cetera. So it's much more of a social, cultural thing than necessarily a religious thing. And so it's interesting, because if you look at Russia, China, and Cuba, all of them in a sense at some point proudly secular countries, under communism, they've not been very good to us. So it's there's a wonderful book by Jim Wallace called God's Politics, and he says in that book, whenever secularism meets bad religion will always win, because people want to believe in something. And by bad religion, he doesn't mean any particular faith, he means fundamentalism, right? And so in China, it'll be interesting to see where it goes, because there's a number of gay rights groups in China. And so there's a growing movement there. And it'll be interesting to see whether the Chinese Communist Party will it let it flourish or not? Or are they going to step in and be more authoritarian and push it down like they've done a bit of? But it's going to be interesting to see where it goes. I'm not quite sure.
Thank you, Brent. Now, are there any other questions from people? No? Well, it's been a tremendous honor to hear you. And Susan, do you want to bring us a time of closure and say thank you?
Yes, thank you everyone who's come here over the months. We're going to take a break for the summer, and we will be back in September with a whole new slate. So I hope you will join us then.
Thank you, Brent. It's been an honor and delight, and continue to, well, pray for and